We insisted on having a book that would reflect the views of people from throughout the world, not just one country. Any of us here in this room probably could have written a book on what they felt worker control is about, and essentially worker Soviets, combining the idea of having community control and worker control. And what we sought was representations from throughout the world. Imperfect as it is, and that's why we're hoping to have a volume 2 to this, because just within the last few years we've had about 15 or 20 examples at least of vibrant cases, and we've also left several out to make this book light enough to carry home. As it is, it's probably, I can even get on a plane, it's so heavy, just 10 copies. But it, I just think it's quite important to examine these cases, and I think it's crucial to understand that there is a syncopation to these cases of worker control. Not just these, but in general throughout the last century and a half, in the sense that they seem to happen all the time. It's not something that goes away. It's something that historically takes place regularly in all parts of the world. And so the questions that we asked many more questions than we answered in many of these essays were highly critical of state socialism, forms of worker control that are imposed upon workers, yet at the same time we are, sympathetic with the idea. And so this is an ecumenical project. It reflects not just different people from countries throughout the world, it also reflects different perspectives. I think the one area that we probably all agree is the fact that we really do need to have a class perspective in understanding the project. And in that context, we do have collections from people who might be anarchists or are anarchists, people who are council communists, people who are Trotskyists, and people who are autonomous, Fourth Internationalists who are not Trotskyists necessarily, but just the full range. And I think that's actually what makes this work so valuable. And I'm saying it myself, I usually don't really try to laud these own projects that we work on. I try to work on with people, but I'm just very happy with this collection. It's really the first time anyone has, I could be standard, I know Ken Coates has written on the subject in the UK, but it's really the first widely published volume collection on the subject of workers' control in 40 years, since Ernest Mandel, who actually published his work in German, right, in 1971. And so we're part of the process of reviving this, and we'd like to have everybody else here join us in this project. Peter is part of the project, and others in this room are integrally involved in trying to advance these ideas. So I hope this to be a discussion about these subjects. So shall I turn over? I'll just turn over briefly to our to the second editor, or the first editor, and then to Victor.
Thank you very much, Manny. Well, first of all, thank you very much to the Brecht Forum to make this presentation possible, and it's an honor to be here. Like Manny said, it's we wanted to put together all the different currents that are in favor of workers' control. Probably we're not sure what is the best way to organize and achieve it, and I think there is not even just one model, because it depends on very much of the type of enterprise, of industry, but also on the country, on the specific, maybe even local culture of communication or whatever. So it can be several different models, and I think that the only ones that probably can establish what's the model that is really useful are the workers that are in the enterprise or the factory or whatever. So we think that it's like some kind of first step to present these different historical experiences because we're not known. We're always told that workers can't take over a factory, that they can't rule the factory. And the problem is that even if it happened all through history, and in every situation, we have cases here and we've tried to divide it somehow into different categories. We've got 4 general overviews and discussion chapters, but then we have a part about workers' councils and self-administration in revolution early 20th century. That's a chapter about Germany, Russia, Italy, and the Spanish Revolution. Then workers' control under state socialism, Yugoslavia and Poland as examples. Then we have workers' control, anti-colonial struggle, democratic revolution, and workers' control. Indonesia, 1945-1946, nearly nobody knows about that, but when they got independence, for example, all the farm workers took over the farms and were managing themselves. The national train system was taken over by the workers and managed by the workers for 2 years in Indonesia. Then we have examples from Algeria, early 60s, Argentina in the 70s, Portugal, Portuguese Revolution, 74, 75. Then a part about workers' control against capitalist restructuring in the 20th century. It's Great Britain in the 70s, the US, Italy in the 70s, and Canada in the early 80s. And then a part about the workers' control now. That we have a chapter about India, about Brazil, about Argentina, and about Venezuela. So we see it's in any situation of change, of crisis, or whatever, and the same thing happens. Workers take over the enterprises and factories. And not because they heard before that other workers did that, and they don't organize in assemblies or in a horizontal way because they knew anything about other councils, but I think they do it because it's some kind of human condition. That the first thing you do is usually you get together and try to talk in a horizontal way in an assembly. It's not, the right always tries to tell us that the men's move, but it's not. It's just the contrary, I think. And we can find these examples not just in factories, but all over. If we look now at the Occupy Wall Street movement, they didn't need the first assembly to elect the chief that is deciding everything, but they created an horizontal assembly system. Same thing happened in all the other cities where this movement spread. So I think it's the most human thing is probably simply to get together and to talk in an assembly or in a horizontal way how to solve things. So why do we know so little about that? Well, because the ones writing the history are not interested in workers' control or in the thing that workers, make it known that workers can manage enterprises or factories. Who was usually writing the leftist history, the parties or the unions? But workers' control is challenging the power or the control of both of them. So they didn't write the history of workers' control. So that's why we think that it's extremely important to bring back this history and to write it to show how it happened in any imaginable situation, in any kind of movement of change, be it democratic or national, socialist or whatever, workers took over. And I think that is extremely important. We're planning, like you said, a second volume because there are loads of examples that are not included in the book. Hungary, for example, 68, 56, Czechoslovakia in 68, but also Japan after the Second World War, when they lost the Second World War. The workers in Japan took over the factories and managed them at the beginning. South Africa, Bolivia in 56. So we've got loads of examples, still Korea and many others where it happened, and we want to go on and have a second volume telling more about these experiences. It has been a pleasure to work with Manny on that project. In fact, we knew each other, we met each other working on when he invited me to collaborate to the encyclopedia of movements and revolutions, and we worked so good together, and we started making more and more projects. I don't know if it's good or not, because if it's healthy, because we sit together Saturday morning, and in 2 hours we create ideas for 6 other books we're going to do. So I'm not really sure if this is healthy, but so we're going to go on doing stuff about workers' control. So our plans are a second volume with different experiences, a volume maybe with historical texts, another volume with workers with workers' interviews about their concrete experiences. So we try to go on to write down or to document this history of workers' control. Another project we're starting at the same time and it will be online probably in November. We created a web page about workers' control, some kind of international node about workers' control, creating some kind of online archive about all these experiences. It's workerscontrol.net. It's going to go online probably in November. It's got three language interfaces. It's Spanish, English, and German. And we think it's extremely important, especially now, to push these things, to make this knowledge available, make these experiences available. Because I think we're just at the beginning of a huge crisis of, and it's a structural crisis. So we will have thousands, 10,000s of factories and enterprises closing down. We just had a presentation at the Venezuelan consulate of the book, that's why we came a bit late. And somebody asked, do you think that workers or people organized workers interested in this book and this experience? And I answered, the question is not if they're interested before, because like all the factories that had been taken over by workers, the workers didn't know before that they were interested in workers' control. And then they did it. And the moment the book is important for these experiences is when they start, once they start. Because then they can like look up what our other experiences have been before. It's not just to compare the experiences, but it's a simple fact to know about them. To know that you're not a lunatic, just the only one thinking about that, but it happens all the time, and it happens in every situation. I think that's extremely important to spread the consciousness that people like taking over workplaces, people in favor of workers and community control are no weird lunatics, but it's really something that happened all over. That's, I think, something important to know when you're acting, that you're not alone.
Okay, Victor.
Thank you.
Thank you for your participation.
Yeah, to me, it was an enormous honor to be invited to participate in this book. My chapter, which appears as chapter 1, is entitled Workers' Control and Revolution. And the reason it gave me particular pleasure is that I wrote much of this article about 35 years ago. And it was sitting around waiting for a moment to come out. And I had the opportunity, of course, the central case studies are essentially as I wrote them back then. And the introduction just had to be modified, the tense a little bit and so on. And in the case of Russia, there's a little bit more information that's come out that reinforces the importance of the workers' control aspect of the Russian Revolution. But then I had to add, of course, a whole section on things that had happened in the last 30 years, which led me to change some of my hypotheses. But the underlying purpose in writing this article is one which has always existed and which still exists today, of wanting to have an alternative vision. And all one can say, there's nothing new about the desire for an alternative vision, but all the time, as years go by, it becomes more evident, more and more people are aware of the need for it, and it becomes at the same time also more and more pressing, more and more urgent as a matter of life and death to all of humanity in a way, because of the environmental dimension of the whole thing. So what one wants in an alternative vision is one that's at once radical and realistic. And I'd like to, since this is a book party, take the liberty of reading the first 2 paragraphs of my piece, because I think it summarizes what I wanted to convey, and then I'll just make a few other remarks more generally. In the perpetual striving of the left to integrate long-range vision and immediate practice, the idea of workers' control occupies a special place. On the one hand, its generalized application would satisfy one of the main requirements for a stateless society. On the other, the basic units and the specific measures involved are such that it can sometimes be implemented within particular enterprises in an otherwise capitalist framework. From the first of these perspectives, workers' control has always been one of the most radical possible demands, indistinguishable in effect from the communist ideal, while from the second, it has been perceived as limited, innocuous, and easily co-optable. How can such a single demand appear at once so easy and so difficult, so harmless and so explosive? The contradiction lies, of course, in the system that has given rise to the demand. Prior to the development of capitalism, the concept of workers' control of the production process could not have been a demand. It was a simple fact of life within the limits allowed by nature. Hence the apparent accessibility of workers' control, which on principle reflects no more than the capacity of all humans to think as well as to do, as Dario said, the very naturalness of it. In these terms, it should not be surprising that workers on occasion take over and run productive enterprises without necessarily having an explicit socialist consciousness or political strategy. The faculties they draw upon for such initiatives are not so much new as they are long suppressed for the majority of the population. So, the task then was to explain the historical conditions under which such movements could arise. And I was struck right away by the phenomenon that the most thoroughgoing attempts to implement this process coincided historically with great moments of political crisis. And so the subject of my inquiry was the relationship between changes at the level of the workplace and changes at the level of the society as a whole. And what makes this question sort of interesting and complicated, every case is unique, is that there's no set connection in terms of sequence or interaction between the government or the state forces on the one hand and the processes taking place at the base on the other. The cases that I looked at in my original essay were Russia, Italy in the immediate post-World War I period when Gramsci was active, the Spanish Revolution, and then Chile during the period of Allende. And then, of course, in the section that I added later, I also took up the cases of Cuba and Venezuela, which are distinct in a number of ways, especially in the fact that, as I'd already observed some time before, the Cuban case was not one where it arose on the part of the workers at the time of the immediate crisis, but was something that was gradually introduced as part of the political strategy after already the taking of power by a revolutionary party. And Venezuela is a sort of a complex mix of the two, which is related to, of course, the Cuban support and assistance and what they've done also in the meantime. But I guess that I would say the challenge now is how to accommodate what's really a permanent crisis. I mean, in studying the links between factory level changes and changes at the level of the state, that does address one of the issues that arises all the time nowadays, and it's great that this is such a diverse collection, but the tension between socialists or Marxists on the one hand and anarchists on the other hand are perfectly expressed in this duality between the state-led revolutionary process and the process from below initiated by the workers. And there's a tendency to sometimes, or to some extent, to pit them against one another. And our task is really to see how they can be reconciled, resolved, how there's some kind of dialectic between them, where one can see ultimately that each depends on the other, that you can't have an effective transition at the level of the whole society without the democratic processes in each particular workplace. At the same time, the autonomous initiatives of the particular workers in each place can easily be crushed unless there's a state apparatus or revolutionary power that's capable of protecting them. So this kind of understanding, insofar as it spreads on the basis of this kind of concrete example that's in this book, could have an influence, especially now, because of the historical moment. There's a kind of reaction against state socialism, as it's put, and so the impulse of many young people coming to an understanding of the class oppression is in an anarchist direction. So the worker control angle is sympathetic to that. But at the same time, when you study the actual instances and what goes into making them successful or not, you realize that it's not sufficient just to have organization at the grassroots. There has to be some kind of central coordination, protection, even ultimately military protection. So the recognition of all this, I think, is embodied in what is now beginning to be called 21st century socialism. And I'm sure most of you have heard of this in connection with Venezuela, where that's more or less an official doctrine expressing the position of the Chavez regime. But so how 21st century socialism goes beyond the previous one, I would say, involves partly the emphasis on the environment, partly the incorporation of the new social movements, a whole issue that was raised in the 60s, but then partly also, and this is our particular focus here, with the emphasis on democracy. And democracy has been recognized, I think, from the beginning as integral to the workers' movement, and this is often not understood. There's an outstanding work by August Nimtz, which talks about democracy as integral to the activism of Marx and Engels themselves. I think that's a very important work which all of us should be familiar with, because it counters certain stereotypes to the effect that Marxism was something that was imposed on the workers, and shows again the kind of dialectic that was involved between the political leadership and the autonomous impulses of the working class. And of course, no one can fail to be aware of the democratic limitations of what I prefer to call first epoch socialism rather than state socialism, to have a sort of neutral description, and also to give you the idea that it's not the only possible epoch of socialism, that it can come back. But what this all reminds us of in terms of democracy is that the issue does come back to an original focus of Marx himself, which is the focus on production relations, and that was his criterion for distinguishing different epochs of history. And so the call here is for the production relations themselves to be democratic. And I think that's a note on which to end. The one thing I should say to round out the circle in terms of how I got interested in it is to recommend that anyone who wants to get a quick taste of what this means in practice should certainly see the film The Battle of Chile, which is a film which I have great affinity for. Anyway, I think that's enough to start. I hope we can have some conversation. Thank you.
Just to give you an example of some of the struggles that people had ideologically in the early 20th century, I guess Dario, since he's an expert, or I can read it, there's very interesting, there's a very interesting chapter by Pietro Di Paolo on the struggle for socialism during the 1919-1920 factory takeovers in Turin, the Fiat Works. And it shows you the kinds of questions that were asked between different ecumenical ideological strands that were all in favor, I would argue even the anarchists certainly, of a a class-based solution for equality, and at the same time, the questions that Victor has posed, and that is, how do you consolidate, how do you protect, how do you defend? And I think that there's a very poignant exchange between Antonio Gramsci and Garino, who was the leader of the anarchist movement. I think it's very interesting to look at. I asked Dario if you don't mind reading it, since you're also Italian.
It's in English.
Just translate it.
Furthermore, for the anarchists, factory councils were not to be confused with the Soviet. While the council is the coalition of all productive labor, the Soviet is the political organ through which the authoritarian communists intend to exercise their power. That's what Garino said. Opposing political views about the future of factory councils were underlined by Garino. Gramsci's agreement with our proposal for the factory councils stopped precisely at the issue of the state, of the dictatorship of the proletariat. He told me, not only are we working together now, but we must do so until the overthrow of capitalism. At that point, if there are different assessments by us communists and by you, the libertarian communists, we'll each go our own way. Until then, we have worked together in action, union action, preparation for the revolution, even armed preparation. In this discussion with Gramsci, Garino clearly indicated his fear that the revolution would evolve into one-party state dictatorship. I said, Garino, look, Gramsci, I think that the dictatorship of the proletariat will eventually mutate and degenerate into the dictatorship of a party, or even worse, of an individual. Gramsci replied, no, Garino, that can't happen. The party will not allow one man to take the reins of power and do whatever he likes. I'm not convinced, I said, and I'll tell you what I believe. When you take power, we'll be the first to be shot. Gramsci jumped to his feet with the big bushy hat and said, Garino, no, Garino, don't say that. That will never happen. Yes, with Gramsci, there was an incredible close relationship. I think that also touches the question that we were talking about, the state. I think I would put it quite in very similar terms like Victor did. We have got the historical experience of whatever, first epoch socialism or state socialism or whatever, and it didn't work. So we know that the state can't be the agent of change. The consequence was this growing of all these autonomous movements, and we don't want to have nothing to do with the state. And I would say it also failed, because the historical experience is if you don't control the state doesn't allow you just to build autonomy. It will just kill you and crush you. So the big question is how to control the state without turning the state into the supposed central agent of change. So the state should be controlled, but be the possibility to open up spaces so that the new can be created from the grassroots, from the concrete situations. Because if we, in Marxist analysis, say that the state is a product of the capitalist and bourgeois society, then it's quite obvious that the new can't be coming out of the state. So, or it's difficult that it comes out of the state. So the big question I think that we have nowadays is just that how make this change possible, and with always the problematic situation that once, if you control the state power, institution power will always be stronger than grassroots power. There is an asymmetry of power. How do we deal with that? Can we push this change in a dialectic relationship between institutions, state, etc., but make the institutions do what the people decide has to be done, and not the other way around, what is the inherent tendency of any institution.
So I urge people to at least try to read this book, because it really provides a lot of data based on the archives from the early 20th century, and compares and contrasts the countries where efforts were engaged in to create workers' councils, and I think we can see very specific differences between the German, Bolshevik, Russian, Italian, and Spanish experiences, and perhaps how they played themselves out. I mean, some people have argued that Spain was really the last, at least European, example of a potential for a socialist revolution. Most socialist scholars would say that it was not a civil war, it was a revolution that was created because, in fact, one of the major elements of the Spanish revolution was the fact that they instituted workers' councils both in the urban areas and in the rural areas, and this is what, in fact, infuriated many of the powers, Franco and the business class and the church and so forth. And it was a really highly ideologically rooted movement where you had a lot of intellectuals who were trained by the successes or failures of the Russian experience, initial successes and subsequent failures. And in July 19th, staged a revolution that was so authentic in many ways by establishing workers' councils, and yes, there was armed insurrections that were there to, if you read the work of Durruti and others, who were there to defend them. And ironically also, the Soviet Union at the time was very much opposed to them because in some ways the Spanish communists, or forgive me, the Spanish Revolution and the communists, however you want to put them, workers' councils, anarchists, Republicans, were in fact engaged in the actuality of socialism, at least initially on the ground. And this is one of the problems that we have to also look at with respect to the Bolshevik Revolution. Obviously, there are many different interpretations, and I have mine, and I probably disagree with everybody here at this table, or maybe have a different interpretation, but mine would be that, in fact, actually, just to point direction to Mark David Mandel, who I only know through the telephone and the internet, from the University of Montreal, Quebec, or the University of Quebec, Montreal, who actually goes to the archives of Russia today, or Russia Federation, not to mention the media outlet. And he actually goes there and comes out with completely different interpretations of the Bolshevik Revolution based on what people actually said, what the problems people had in establishing worker collectives and communes in the factories and so forth. We're talking about a similar situation to Argentina in many ways, where you have intellectuals who are marginalized, where you have students who are marginalized, and also within the factories you have employers who have basically abandoned them or disinvested in them and reinvested in other corporations. But I think it's instructive in reading Mandel's work, in Mark David Mandel, or how he prefers to be called David Mandel, in the specific sense that he is actually countering the established bourgeois literature and journalism of people such as David Remnick and Service and so forth, as well as Daniel Pipes, Robert Service and Daniel Pipes, by arguing that all you have to do is go to the archives. Well, that's what they said, but they didn't read them closely enough because they had an ideological agenda. Well, okay, maybe David Mandel does as well, but at least it's one that is more balanced and fair in the sense that he's looking at the problems that workers' councils face. He's actually telling us that there was a revolution that took place. This is not something that was imposed from above. That in fact, if you take a look at the summer of 1917, the Bolshevik Party, counter to most people in the, forgive me, DSA and others, was the majority party. That most Russian workers favored a Bolshevik solution, which meant in their, whatever it meant, terminology, in terms of nomenclature today, it meant then that we favor workers' control. And I think that this is something that really kind of provides perhaps a fourth internationalist and Trotskyist perspective on things, but it also tells you something about the complications that we have today that are similar to those that were in place nearly 80 years ago, 78 years ago or something like that. Yeah, 76 years ago. And so anyway, I would hope we can have a discussion about these issues as well as some of the others that are discussed, and also perhaps the current insurrections that are taking place throughout the world, especially here in New York City.
I'll just make one other comment that struck me in thinking about this. The whole question of an area of struggle that is at once very friendly, congenial, easy to understand, such as the idea of running one's own workplace. The idea that it's being at once something natural in that sense, but yet profoundly revolutionary in terms of what it implies in relation to the way the society is organized. That's exactly the situation we confront with the issue of the environment at the present time. I think it's good to see those in connection with one another. Because on the one hand, everyone is in favor of improving the environment. Everybody's talking, almost, you know, it's the 99% talking about the environment, about being green and so on. And yet, if you get into the details of what has to be transformed, of all the structural changes that would be needed to actually reduce the human footprint on the globe, it's an absolutely explosive thing. It's not at all an easy thing, and this is what isn't recognized. So I think this, in this sense, the workers' control issue is a very appropriate one for us to keep in mind.
Yeah, maybe one interesting thing about the environmental thing, because I think we have also to look who has an objective interest in changing things. Because, and I think that, you know, there can be people that can take a side. It doesn't mean that if you're not a worker or not out of a popular community, you can't support a revolutionary change. You can. But the objective interest to change things, I think, is just among workers and communities, organized communities. And just to make an example, I'm living about half a year in Venezuela. I just came back end of September, and 4 weeks ago I visited again Alcázar. It's an aluminium hut in Venezuela where I did work before. I wrote about the aluminium hut. And the basic industries in like steel, aluminium, and others in Venezuela are deficitary. They're not working well. It's the production cost is even higher than the world market prices of the stuff they produce, mainly because of old machinery, corruption, and everything. So they tried for years, since '98, to restructure everything, and it didn't work. In 2009, Chavez organized a weekend seminar with 300 workers of the workers' control collectives out of the factories, and they started setting up a plan for restructuring the whole industry and also introducing workers' control. Then something happened that is linked to what I said before about institutions. Nothing happened because the institutions in charge were not interested in changing anything. They're living up the old model. The people working in the administration are taking their 10% share when they import stuff or buy stuff from transnational companies or sell it to them. So the real interest is just by the workers and the communities. What happened? Chavez at a certain point said, okay, yo me la juego con los trabajadores. I bet on the workers, and he simply nominated last year in May for all 70 factories workers as presidents. And then the problem started because they have now parts of the government, the regional administration, parts of the factory administration, and the reformist Bolivarian Union against workers' control. So in Alcázar, for example, you have got 3 currents of unions. One is I would say the revolutionaries in favor of workers' control, and it's out of their rank and file that the president was chosen. Then you have a reformist Bolivarian Union, and then you have a big union of the Acción Democrática, like the former corrupt social democratic ruling party. The interesting thing that happened is that the reformist Bolivarian Union is boycotting the process of workers' control. Because since they control much of the factory, their living out of the corruption and everything. But if you go down to the ground, the workers of the Acción Democrática Union are supporting workers' control. And that reminded me very much what
one of the old liberal capitalist parties,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
No, it's also, you know what, yeah. And if you read what writers wrote about, like Korsch or Panikirk, about the councils in 1918 in Germany, they wrote exactly that. They said, once you're down to concrete questions, the parties don't matter anymore. And that's what's happening there. For example, in Alcázar, they closed down a production line because it was old machines that didn't work anymore. And some of the workers proposed to create a department where they start inventing and producing parts and of the machinery and replacements and stuff that is imported up to now. I visited this department. All the workers in this department are from the union, from this old liberal capitalist union, and their discourse was, well, you know, once you have workers' control, the creativity of workers can do incredible things, and in fact they started producing spare parts that were imported up to now to a lower price and a better quality.
I just very briefly, I echo Victor and Dario completely that when we talk about workers' councils, we're not just talking about the workers themselves, we're talking about the working class, which exists both in neighborhoods and also in workplaces. And they're not just factories, they're highways, they're hospitals, they're educational institutions, they're nonprofits, they're public sector, everywhere that we can see them. But I think that there has to be an intersection, particularly with respect to the environment, which is in huge crisis right now, to understand that you can't build a petrochemical plant in the middle of a neighborhood.
Just a few seconds, and I wanted to add that I think we're not speaking in favor of whatever worker supremacy or that it's this the only contradiction or whatever. There are lots of questions of race, gender, etc. But the one where we all need is that we have to sell our workforce to reproduce ourselves. So this is the base where we can start we can get together for a struggle, always in mind all the other types of oppression that exists. But what we have in common is that we all have to sell our workforce to live. So that's, I think, why. And that if we don't change the mode of production, we won't change society. So we might just fight certain types of oppression, make life better for people, that's fine, everything is fine. But if we really want to cut all that and have a free society, we have to overcome capitalist system. Like that's otherwise it will always reproduce capitalist behavior. So that's the main problem. And it's something that is, and there has to be also a certain point where there is a breaking point, a crush, because there's a very romantic idea that we just take it over bit by bit and change it bit by bit, but it's something we can read already in Rosa Luxemburg when she says it will work because capitalism won't allow it. So there will be at a certain point a point where we have to have a break. But about the councils, I think, yes, I think it's after the experience of, after the failed experience of authoritarian socialism, after the failed experience of non-democratic, supposed democratic, authoritarian democracy or whatever, people start to recognize that the only way to change things is if we do it ourselves and we talk about the things and how to change it. That's the only guarantee we have that things will change like we want them to change. So I think that the assembly council system or whatever, the way it's sprung up again throughout history, it will again come up, or is coming up, and will be more important. And I think that's the way to go. If it really works or they will crush us, that's another question. But that's the way to go.
There's a Peter's hand up, and the gentleman here, the gentleman, I don't know who's first. Is there Peter first? Peter Manny?
The Occupy Wall Street, I think, is an interesting case in point. Obviously, it's a fantastic movement. occupied by people owned by a private company. And there's interstices between public and private. Zuccotti, I don't know, Brookfield Company got air rights, but in return for the air rights, which was a subsidy, they had to provide a public park. And that's the beginning of a possibility in this whole country that a company that gets tax subsidies to move to Indiana gets certain tax subsidies, and for that they have a responsibility, social contract with the factory or the service that they're providing. So these kids are doing a great favor for us to understand the rights of people to occupy public spaces, even owned by private companies, or private building corporation. So I think it's a very exciting moment. I don't know what's going to happen, but I think it's very exciting, and we owe a great debt of gratitude to these young people. I don't know how you think about that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I just, this is not directly related to the Occupy movement, but I think it's illustrative of the point about the class nature of the whole thing. It's not just individual factories, and also about the creativity. One of the examples from the Spanish Revolution that struck me most especially was the fact that one of their innovations was that seasonal work, there would be workers who worked in the agricultural sector in one season. When work was low, they would shift over to another sector in the other season. You can't really imagine organizing that on the basis of market relations. It's something that reflects the common intelligence and the collective ability of the people. And I think this is a thing that's developing and being encouraged, and that we can further encourage in the present movement.